Okay, so I've already lectured on the Texas-Mexican War, and hence that was in the previous test. But it'll be on this next one as well because it's going to be addressed in the reading for this week. Then I'll lecture on the Mexican-American War right now. And then we'll talk about whether or not to do another lecture on the Spanish-American War. So these are some of the key points that I'll be talking about. And you don't have to write everything down right now because I'm going to talk about them individually in slides that are coming up. So in case you don't get to write it all down, you'll have time. All right, so the Mexican-American War, I call it that. Some sources from the US will simply call it the Mexican War. Just so you know, they're a reference to the same one. There's the long-term causes that I've already lectured on before, and that is in a lecture about US expansion that was included in a previous in the previous test, where a lot of the expansion of the United States in the 19th century was at the expense of Spanish America and Mexico. But some examples very briefly: the Louisiana Purchase, which doubled the size of the United States. The South, all the way from the Southeast in Florida to the Southwest in California. So yeah, Florida and Texas are examples of filibustering. Again, for this class, filibustering is a reference to people who armed themselves and militarily took over land that didn't belong to the United States, the country they were citizens of. They would show up and say, "We bring you freedom and independence, and we're going to be in charge." And that's what happened multiple times in Florida. And that happened in Texas as well, several times. The one in 1836 was the one that was successful. Then there is the general belief in the 19th century in manifest destiny. Manifest destiny, the idea that the United States was destined to spread from sea to shining sea because of their Anglo superiority and because they were favored by Christ. It was a term that was coined by John L. O'Sullivan in 1845. O'Sullivan was the editor of a magazine, a periodical. So in 1845, there was a presidential campaign in the United States. James Polk was running for president, and he ran on a ticket of expansionism, essentially a ticket of manifest destiny. Now, these three things are some of his campaign slogans. One of them was reoccupation of Oregon. Another was 54-40 or fight. Both of these had to do with Oregon in the Northwest. Basically, both the United States and the United Kingdom both claimed that Oregon was theirs, that Oregon belonged to them. So in 1843, the United States encouraged what they called Oregon fever, where there were thousands of people from the US who left to Oregon to help the United States have a stronger claim over that land, to help us have a stronger claim over the United Kingdom. But the way Polk described it, basically serves as a reminder that spin wasn't invented in the 21st century. He didn't say, let's go have a stronger claim on Oregon. He would make it seem like it was ours and the UK was trying to take it from us. So we weren't trying to get a stronger claim over it. We were trying to take it back. We were reoccupying it. And not only did he argue that Oregon was ours, but he would say 54-40 or fight, meaning not only is Oregon ours, but Oregon goes all the way north to the southern border of Alaska. And he's saying they're going to recognize that or we're going to go to war with them. 54-40 or fight. And then when it comes to Texas, again, Texas became its own country for 10 years. And in 1845, he was saying not that we are going to annex Texas and make it part of the United States, but again, he was spinning it as we're going to take it back. We're going to re-annex it as if it had belonged to the United States and we're just taking it back. So in 1845, this was successful. This helped get President Polk elected as president. And so he won that election. But then before he was inaugurated, the president that was already there, Tyler, he annexed Texas before Polk was inaugurated. Now, you might recall from the class lecture on the Texas-Mexican War that Mexico never acknowledged the independence of Texas. Mexico claimed that the Treaty of Velasco was not a valid treaty because the president of Mexico did not have the authority to sign away and give away Mexican land. That only Mexican Congress could do that. And so Mexico never acknowledged the independence of Texas. Antonio Lopez de Santana, he was the president of Mexico. And during this period, before the Tex-Mexican War until the Mexican-American War, he would become a hero and they made him president. And then he was a disgrace because he lost Texas. But then we got into a war with the United States again, so they brought him back. And so there's this back and forth of love and hate between Mexico and Antonio Lopez de Santana. Now, when all this tension was rising in 1845, the United States sent a man by the name of Slidell to Mexico to offer $25 million for California and New Mexico. And Mexico says no. So then we get to some of the things that triggered there's the long-term causes, and then there's the things that triggered it at that moment. Like I mentioned, Polk was running an expansion. Tyler ended up annexing Texas at the end of 1845. Both countries broke off diplomatic relations. When two countries do that, it means they're getting ready for war. It means they've exhausted all the diplomatic means of resolving this issue. So then they pull their diplomats from each other's country and ready for war. So both countries sent their armies to the border, but the border was not agreed upon. The border was in dispute. I'll come back to that last bullet point. Texas said that their southern border was the Rio Grande. Mexico would say that the southern border of Texas was the Nueces River. Now, if you look at this map, this is the Rio Grande. Here's the Nueces. And so the space in between the two rivers is actually not that much. But the implications were big out west, where by going with the Rio Grande, you're more than doubling the size of Texas, as opposed to going with the Nueces River. So both countries sent their armies to disputed territory. And Polk knew that this would lead to the beginning of fighting. I mean, he literally sent the army to the disputed territory for the purpose of starting this war. But back then, presidents still had to follow the Constitution, which says that only Congress can declare war. So President Polk went to Congress and lied to them. Well, I'll explain what I mean by that. He went to Congress and told them that we had been attacked by Mexico, that American blood was shed on American soil. The thing is, when he said this to US Congress, he did not have confirmation that this had actually happened. He knew it was going to happen because he sent them to disputed territory to do that, not because we had been attacked kind of innocently or unexpectedly. There was a senator at the time in Congress named Abraham Lincoln, who had ended up having something called the Spot Resolution, where he called President Polk on that claim. He said, if you say that American blood has been shed on American soil, show me the spot where this happened. And he was basically trying to prove that Polk did not have any confirmation of this actually happening, or him knowing that it happened. He knew it was going to happen because that's what he sent the army there to do. Now, another important factor, kind of on the eve of this war, was the Wilmot Proviso. The United States had been trying to balance out free states and slave states since the creation of the United States. And this was definitely escalating throughout the 19th century. And so with Texas being annexed as a slave state, then it became important for Congress to say, okay, we just annexed Texas as a slave state. Any land that we get as a result of this war, any additional land we get as a result of this war, will not be open to slavery, which, is trying to balance out free states and slave states, but is also demonstrating how intent we are in getting more land as a result of this war. All right, so the fighting begins in the disputed territory. Then the United States sends its military in three prongs. They're, one group right down the middle, another group hopping along the coast, and a third group going straight to claim the rest of the Southwest right from the start. Now, in the middle of the 19th century, that coincided with a big wave of Irish immigration to the United States, because that coincided with the Irish potato famine of the 1840s to 1860s. So there were lots of Irish immigrants to the United States. Now, these immigrants would arrive to the East Coast, and they experienced a number of things. They experienced a lot of congestion, just a lot of people in those cities, not a lot of opportunity, and they experienced a lot of discrimination. The Irish, were not yet thought of as a white group. That doesn't happen until 100 years later in US history. There were people that thought of them as almost like a different racial group, not just a different white ethnic group. A big factor in why they were discriminated against is the fact that they were Catholic. They argued that the Irish would never become loyal to the United States because they were Catholic. Their first loyalty was going to be to the Pope, the Catholic Pope, and not to the United States. And so they were to be distrusted. So one of the ways that the Irish both looked for opportunity and a way of demonstrating their loyalty to this country was to enlist in the US military. People who are not US citizens have been part of the US military from then, since the 19th century until the present. You don't have to be a US citizen to serve in the US military. So they join the US military, and they are sent to fight in this war against Mexico. But they were discriminated against in the United States for being Catholic, and they were attacking another Catholic country. And many Irish people couldn't help but see the parallels between how England took over Ireland and discriminated against them for being Catholic, and the way that the United States was treating Mexico. A lot of them ended up abandoning the US military. Now, this was not unique to the Irish. The Mexican-American War is actually the war in US history with the highest rate of desertion, the highest rate of people who abandoned the US military during the war. So now some of them, some Irish and some non-Irish, not only abandoned the US military during this war, but they switched sides. They created the San Patricio Batallion, being led by John Riley, and they joined the Mexican army and fought against the United States. One example of where they did this was at the Battle of Churubusco in 1847, where 260 fought as part of the San Patricio Battalion, and a lot of them ended up getting captured. 80 captured, 50 executed, 15 branded. Now, what does that mean? So, captured means they just caught them, right? Executed means the majority of them were made to dig essentially their grave sites, and then they were killed for treason. Kind of similar to what Mexico did to the Texans in the Tex-Mexican War. It's not uncommon for the penalty of going AWOL during war for it to be execution, the death penalty. Now, there were some who were not executed. There were some who were whipped. There were some that were branded. What does it mean to be branded? It's like branding livestock, where you take a hot iron with a symbol, you put it in the fire, and then you put it on the skin, the hide of the animal to brand it, to mark it for life. So 15 humans, 15 people, were branded, including John Riley. John Riley was not executed because he had gone AWOL before the war began. And so there's this different penalty for abandoning the US military during times of peace versus during time of war. Yeah, in his case, they branded him with the letter D for deserter. But they branded him in the face in one cheek. Then they realized it was, well, I don't know if they did it intentionally or not, but they did it in one cheek. And it turns out it was backwards. So then they branded him on the other cheek, right side up. So yeah, there's the San Pascual Battalion, an instance where there were many US soldiers who left the US military, switched sides, fought with the Mexican military against the United States. And the United States officially denied the existence of the San Patricio Battalion all the way until 1915. So for like 65 years, the United States said, no, that's just a rumor, that didn't happen. Now, historians from the US and Mexico would also, write about this in ways that also had their degree of spin. In the US, historians would say, the San Patricio Battalion, they were mercenaries. They were people who left the US military because Mexico offered to pay them more. And then, and they would say, John Riley was so ashamed of what he had done that he never showed his face in the US ever again, and he lived as a drunkard in Mexico. Same facts, different spin. Then Mexican historians would say, the reason they left the US military is because they saw that it was a morally wrong war, that it was a war of aggression. And with regard to John Riley, again, same facts, different spin. They would say that John Riley was so adamant of that what he had done was the right thing that he chose never to go back to the United States, married a Mexican woman, and then implied lived happily ever after. Yeah, that's the San Patricio Battalion. Another part of this war was the siege of Veracruz. You might recall Veracruz as that place where Cortez arrived when he then sort of landed and then made his way to Tenochtitlan, which then became Mexico City. The United States also went to the port of Veracruz and laid siege to it. What does it mean to lay siege? And by the way, this is kind of hard to tell, but this dark area is the Gulf of Mexico. Here's Veracruz. The United States attacked it from land and sea. To lay siege means to surround it and not let anything in or out and bombard it. So here's a painting of US ships attacking the fort at Veracruz. There is the landing of US troops, 12,000 troops landed in Mexico. This was the largest amphibious landing in history up to that point. It was the D-Day of its day before World War II. And then here's a painting of US troops, surrounding it and bombarding Veracruz. And then from the Mexican point of view, they claimed that the United States was laying siege and bombarding the whole city of Veracruz, not just the military fort. Then there was also a last-minute filibustering in California, where there were US citizens in California living there already. Some of them armed themselves and took over a military fort in Northern California. And then they, similar to previous filibustering expeditions, they said, we bring you freedom and independence. We militarily take you over and we're going to be in charge. And so they created a flag, calling it the Bear Flag Republic, and, pulled up the flag. And California, so Texas was its own country for 10 years. California was its own country for less than a month. 3 weeks and a half later, the US military arrives and basically says, what's going on here? And they're like, sorry. And they take down the Bear Flag Revolt flag and put up the US flag instead. When the US military, the US Army arrives to California, they end up having something called the Battle of San Pascual. This was the only battle in the war that the United States clearly lost. There are others that are more debated, but this is the clearest one of all. Yet it was a battle that wasn't fought against Mexico. These were Californios, not the Mexican army. These were people who lived in California, who, of Mexican, how do I put it? These were Mexican citizens in California, but a lot of Californios had been there since the time when it belonged to Spain. And what the Californios were known for being good horsemen, and they were not well supplied. One of their only weapons were lances, kind of those long sticks with a sharp end, or a knife in the front. And what they did is they sent out a small number of men on horses and got the US cavalry to chase after them. They led the cavalry into a ravine, and then the Californios were waiting at that ravine, and then they descended on the US cavalry and they had to retreat. And so, yeah, one of the only battles that the US clearly lost. You don't have to know Andres Pico. He was the last Mexican governor of California. I will introduce you to Los Ninos Heroes. When the United States Army made its way to Mexico City, one of the last battles was at the castle of Chapultepec in Mexico City. This castle was a place where they would train Mexican cadets to become soldiers, kind of like an ROTC, like we have in the US. And these cadets ended up fighting against the US Army and lost. And at the end of that battle, these alleged children, Ninos Heroes, child heroes, there were 6 of them who kind of sacrificed themselves. They took down the Mexican flag. 2 of them wrapped themselves on the flag, and then they all jumped off the edge of the castle, to their death, rather than allow the United States to capture them or take down the flag. This is to Mexico, kind of what the Alamo is to the United States, kind of remember the Alamo. In Mexico, children get taught about the Ninos Heroes, kind of these child martyrs. So here's the names of the 6 children, but there's reason to believe that this story is fabricated. For one, no one talked about Los Ninos Heroes until the 100-year anniversary of this war. The Mexican president, at 100 years later, told this story, and then journalists started asking, oh, really? So, where can we learn more? You really caught our attention with the story of these child heroes. A week later, they find the remains of 6 people off of, kind of at the bottom of this castle. And they say that it's the 6 Ninos Heroes. Until this day, there's like a memorial for them there. But like I said, it's some of the facts don't add up, and it's too coincidental the way their evidence was found. But nevertheless, every country has its degree of propaganda. This is an example of Mexican propaganda that, to my knowledge, they still teach children in Mexico. The war ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. It was a treaty that was signed by Mexican Congress. And so this time the United States didn't make the United States did not make the mistake that Texas made with the Texas-Mexican War, where Mexico could just say, the president doesn't have the right to sign away land. Only Congress can do that. Well, this time they made Mexican Congress sign it, giving the United States, some sources will tell you that Mexico lost 1/3 of its land. Other sources will tell you that Mexico lost half its land. Basically, it's a matter of whether you include or exclude Texas. Without Texas, Mexico lost 1/3. If you include Texas, Mexico lost half of their land. And the states that they lost, including Texas, are Texas, California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, as well as parts of Colorado and Wyoming. So here's a map of the area they took. Again, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, Arizona, Nevada, California, parts of Wyoming. And let's see. So the treaty, among the things the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo did, the United States got this land for 15 million, whereas before the war they offered 25. Any Mexican citizens could become US citizens by staying in the Southwest for a year. There was an article that was originally included in the treaty that said that Mexicans were going to be, their land, culture, and language was going to be protected. But then US Congress cut it out and said they didn't need, that their rights were going to be protected, but they weren't. And then another interesting thing has to do with Native Americans. Native Americans in the Southwest had to decide whether they were Mexican because they were Mexican citizens, or whether they were Native American. If they were Native, they would not become US citizens. And they had to petition to be recognized by the United States under the US tribal system. If they chose to be Mexican, then they're getting rid of their indigenous identity, at least officially, but would become US citizens in a year. And FYI, Native Americans in the United States did not automatically become citizens until like 75 years later, 1924. There was also another, I don't know this for a fact, but I think the US had 25 million designated for this to begin with. And so when they gave 15 million for the whole Southwest, they had 10 million left over. And then they realized they wanted a little bit more land. So they gave those 10 million for that last strip of land down here, the Gadsden Purchase, for the Southern Pacific Railroad.